As the years go by, we start to notice things that used to go unnoticed. Games that once seemed revolutionary don't impress as much today, and that's normal. But what happens when we revisit a game and feel a strangeness we didn't even remember existed? Need for Speed was announced as a revival of the franchise, a return to the roots of Underground, with streetcar culture more alive than ever. But there's one detail I only noticed after going back to play it. Ventura Bay, the city that was supposed to be the heart of this world, feels empty. Not just in a literal sense, but on an almost unsettling level. Everything happens at night, always with wet streets, as if time had frozen in an eternal rainy night. But the worst part is that there's no one there. I can't quite explain it. It feels like you're invisible. Whether you're speeding through avenues, alleys, the wealthiest neighborhoods, or industrial areas, the sensation is always the same. There's no life in this place. And this feeling is something I didn't get from older or newer games in the series. But my real question is, why does this game, more than any other, carry such a heavy sense of loneliness or emptiness? And why did I only notice this years later? Need for Speed, the franchise reboot, was a game that arrived with high expectations, but also within a very peculiar context. After a period of experimenting with different styles in games like Shift, Nitro, Hot Pursuit, and World, the franchise was searching for its identity. Between 2007 and 2013, the series tried to reinvent itself in various ways, but few titles from that era stood out commercially. The only major commercial success during this time was Hot Pursuit, which, while not universally loved, was the best-selling title since Carbon. However, after the failure of games like The Run, Black Box, the studio responsible for many of the franchise's classic titles, was shut down. This led EA to hand over development responsibilities to a new studio, Ghost Games, tasked with bringing the franchise back to its peak. In 2013, with Need for Speed Rivals, Ghost Games tried to steer the series in a new direction, but despite impressive graphics, the game was criticized for its lack of innovation and technical issues. The expectation was that the next title would be a major milestone, and that's when development began on Need for Speed. One of the biggest moves with this game was breaking the franchise's tradition of annual releases, a pattern that had been in place since 1994. Need for Speed was the first game in nearly 20 years not to follow an annual schedule, which was a relief for fans and the community, as many previous titles had suffered from rushed development cycles. The idea was to allow more time for development and avoid the quality issues seen in earlier releases. Need for Speed launched in November for PS4 and Xbox One, and in May 2016 for PC. The release came with lofty expectations but also deeply divided the community. Critics were split. While some praised the game for its atmosphere, customization, and graphics, others found it lacking, especially due to technical problems, a weak story, and one of its biggest flaws, which I'll discuss later. What recently bothered me about Need for Speed 2015 wasn't the constant nighttime and rainy atmosphere, which actually gives off a cool underground vibe, but the fact that Ventura Bay feels like a city abandoned before it even came to life. Driving through its streets feels like being on a movie set where the city was built just for the main scenes, with no real life behind it. There are no pedestrians, no urban bustle, no signs that anyone besides illegal racers inhabits this place. It's as if the city is stuck in time, eternally waiting for the next race. Even the sparse traffic cars seem lost, driving aimlessly with no clear destination, wandering like ghosts. If you pay attention, even the urban details reinforce this feeling. There are no parked cars, nothing to suggest people live there. The streets are always pristine. No toppled trash cans, no garbage bags on the sidewalk, no flickering neon signs with defects, no weathered billboards. It feels like a city meant to be observed from afar, not lived in. And this lack of urban life now triggers something in me when I think about my immersion in the game. In titles like Underground 2 or Most Wanted 2005, for example, the city had a certain urban chaos. Fallen streetlights, destructible billboards, and even traffic movement felt more organic. But in Need for Speed 2015, Ventura Bay isn't a city. It's like an artificial stage waiting for you to pass through, never changing, never reacting. Need for Speed, I don't know. It also gives you the feeling that no one's watching you, like you're invisible. This sense of emptiness in a world that simply doesn't react to the player is, for me today, a defining trait of Need for Speed. Honestly, I enjoy this kind of vibe in some games, but at the same time, I feel like in this case, it just leaves a lingering sense of loneliness. After playing for a few minutes, it's easy to feel isolated, as if you're in a city that's just waiting to be explored but never truly interacts with what's around you. Ventura Bay was modeled after various US cities like Los Angeles, with its diverse urban and coastal areas, but the problem is that despite its visual variety, the city is static, lacking much life of its own for a modern game from a big company like EA. It ends up being more of a backdrop than a character. The contrast between what the city could have been and what it actually is creates this sense of emptiness. Where are the people who inhabit this space? Where are the real reactions to your presence? The lack of any active response from the city contributes to this disconnected atmosphere. The biggest flaw in Need for Speed lies in its near-total dependence on an online mode. While the game was designed to foster a sense of community and competition, this focus on multiplayer ends up compromising crucial aspects of the player experience, becoming the production's worst defect. Forcing players to always be connected to the internet, even for single-player mode, feels like an immensely frustrating decision. While the intent might have been to create a more dynamic, living world feel, or maybe it was just a dumb EA idea, the reality is that online interactions often feel superficial, and players end up racing solo, just with other digital presences around. The real issue is that by making everything internet-dependent, the game loses the essence of the franchise. The freedom to enjoy an offline experience without the stress or worries we're used to in online games. Imagine being in the middle of an event and your internet drops. That's a direct blow to your personal experience with the game. The multiplayer factor, which could have been a draw for a competition-focused game, doesn't deliver the emotional payoff you'd expect. Players end up isolated in their adventures without a truly engaged community. This diminishes the experience's value, often making the game feel like a disconnected session with no real evolution or progress. The gameplay in Need for Speed follows a path that blends the franchise's classic experience with some changes and attempts at innovation. However, the racing dynamics end up being a double-edged sword, striking a delicate balance between fun and frustration. The core premise of street racing, escapes, and police chases is there, but the way the game handles these elements feels like it lacks substance. One negative point is the car physics and handling system. The game perfectly captures the sensation of speed, and on straightaways, there's nothing to complain about. The trouble starts when you hit curves. You're completely at the mercy of the car, often forced to drift because the grip is wildly unstable and uncontrollable. And if we're talking negatives, we can't ignore the police AI. Seriously, the cops in this Need for Speed are the worst in the entire franchise. They literally crash into everything. Here's some good advice: don't get anywhere near a patrol car or you're in for a massive headache. If we step back and compare Need for Speed with some of the franchise's older titles, it's clear how those games, even with less technology, managed to create a near-perfect sense of immersion. Underground 2 from 2004, for example. That game had a city that, despite hardware limitations, nailed the vibe perfectly. I've even said in past videos that no Need for Speed has ever been as balanced as Underground 2. The traffic felt convincing, and the visual variety of streets and neighborhoods made Bayview seem like a believable place. In Need for Speed, we have a game with ultra-realistic graphics and a bigger map, but ironically, it feels emptier. The decision to keep it perpetually night with wet streets helped craft a unique aesthetic. Some even say this game should have been called Underground 3, but it'd definitely draw a lot of hate from fans. Ventura Bay, despite its excellent rainy atmosphere, carried an emptiness on multiple levels. With no cycle to show something's happening, and little to no traffic variation, the game delivered a world that felt frozen in time. The issue here isn't just the presence of NPCs or traffic, but how those elements are used to bring the game world to life. Graphical realism alone isn't enough. Without well-crafted immersion, even the most beautiful city can feel like a soulless model. And that's exactly how I feel about Need for Speed today. a visually stunning game that feels like a place where no one actually lived. Need for Speed is the kind of game that stirs mixed feelings. It has incredible visuals, a strong underground vibe, and a customization system that left me really satisfied. But at the same time, it carries a lack of energy that's hard to overlook. What makes Need for Speed a bit frustrating is its untapped potential. If it had an optional online system and more polished gameplay, it could have been one of the franchise's best. But as it was released, it became a game of what if. What if they'd added a day-night cycle? What if the AI were more refined? What if the map were more diverse or bigger? These questions are part of the game's legacy. In the end, Need for Speed isn't a bad game. It just didn't deliver everything it could have. It's a title that excites at first contact, impresses with its visual style and striking sound, but over time starts to show its flaws. Still, for many, it has a special charm. That mix of nostalgia with the frustration of something that could have been so much more than it was. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about with you all today. Please don't take anything personally. Opinions are meant to spark dialogue, and I want to chat with you all. I'm always paying attention to what you ask for here, so leave a comment, and if you liked the video, subscribe. More ideas are coming soon.